All right, welcome to Philosophy TV. I'm Tuomas Tahko. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki and currently visiting at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
And I'm Tahko Hofweber. I'm a philosopher at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Okay, so we're talking about the possibility of metaphysics today. That's quite a broad topic, but we're hoping to shed some light on some of the key issues about, I suppose, the foundations and the methodology of metaphysics, and what kind of a discipline metaphysics is, if it is a valid discipline. So we're going to talk about the role of metaphysics and perhaps put out some views or a range of views about what the role of metaphysics is and how we should or could go on about doing it. Does that sound right, Thomas?
That sounds good.
Okay. So
do you want? Okay.
We...
let me see. Let me say something about why I think there's a problem here, or an issue that needs to be addressed.
Sure.
Right. Okay. So everybody who is doing inquiry wants to find out what reality is like in some sense. And the question is, why is there anything to do for metaphysics in this larger project, and what precisely is it? So one way to think about it is simply as follows, that if you take any particular case of some question of fact, you might think that there's some science that already addresses this particular question, and that science should be seen as the place where this question will be answered. And if this is true for every question of fact, then there wouldn't be anything left open, any further question of fact that is left open for metaphysics to address. So, if you take some classic metaphysical problems like the philosophy of time or something like that, you might think that, wait a minute, time, that's already addressed in one of the sciences. And how should we understand what's left open for metaphysics to do, given what is done elsewhere in inquiry? And there's some just general, it's not necessarily an anti-metaphysical starting point. It's just the question is, what is metaphysics doing in this larger project of inquiry? Does that sound fair?
That sounds fair to me. Okay. Then I suppose that we have a variety of different views about whether there are facts of the matter that metaphysics researches, and whether we can really reach those facts. Even if there are facts, there are some epistemic issues to consider about our access to those facts. So I thought we could talk about a little bit about the sort of range of views that we have here. So at one end, we would have something like extreme deflationism about metaphysics, the sort of view according to which there are perhaps no objective metaphysical facts to discover, or there's a variety of different options here. One of them might be that the metaphysical questions are just linguistic questions. Do you think that's a fair way to characterize deflationism about metaphysics?
Well, fair enough, I guess. Right, so it's one way of saying that really there isn't really anything for metaphysics to do, or at least no question of fact for it to answer, right? You could believe that because you thought that all the questions of fact are answered by the sciences, and metaphysics, if it has anything to do at all, should do something else, and therefore there's nothing for it to do. Or you might think that the traditional metaphysical debates are really based on people talking past each other, and therefore once everything is clarified, there will be no question of fact left open to settle. Or you might have, of course, the sort of other, so there's sort of a intermediate view, let's say, where you think that there are certain questions of fact that are properly addressed in metaphysics, and then there's an issue about whether or not that means that these questions have to be therefore not addressed by the sciences, or if they can be also addressed by the sciences, but they're still be done. And then finally, there is the sort of more extreme view, where the thought is that that metaphysics is in some sense the most revealing discipline about what reality is like, and that in the end, if you really want to know what reality is like, the sciences only give you, so to speak, a first approximation to what it's really like, and then metaphysics will maybe start from there or maybe not, and then tell you what the the most revealing story is about reality. So that that would be basically where where right. So those are sort of the options on a spectrum.
And where would you say that you stand on this spectrum yourself?
I personally would say I stand in the reasonable middle, where there are certain questions of fact that are properly in the domain of metaphysics, but and these questions are not verbal, or these questions are not immediately addressed or answered in one of the sciences. But that metaphysics can't claim to be the most revealing discipline of what reality is like, and that metaphysical work is legitimate but limited. Where would you place yourself?
Well, I like to think that I'm at one of the extremes, but not the deflationist extreme, but rather the other end, which you characterized.
Right.
So perhaps this sort of idea, I like to call it an Aristotelian idea, that metaphysics is the first philosophy, and there are certainly some metaphysical facts to be discovered. However, I think that this still leaves open the question of whether the domain of metaphysics is specific and only metaphysicians, say, can discover metaphysical truths, or whether the sciences as well are inquiring into the same sort of domain of things. And here I think that my view is more modest, because I don't think that metaphysicians should go and tell scientists how things are in the world, but rather the two disciplines are parallel or complementary in some sense.
All right. So maybe we'll talk about some of the sort of general setup and options, and maybe so there's one sort of way in which I personally like to think about this, which is related to the question about whether or not there is any question of fact that is properly addressed in metaphysics, and whether or not for metaphysics to be what it's, that question has to be reasonably separated from other questions that are addressed in other parts of inquiry that are in particular very successful.
Right.
So one way to think about this is, but just by taking the example of the ontology of mathematical objects, for example, which I think is a very illustrative example, although, of course, just one among many metaphysical or even ontological disciplines. So ontology, as we should say, is part of metaphysics. It's controversial how precisely to characterize it, but it's roughly about what exists or what there is, although that particular formulation is controversial. But one way to think about it is the following, right? So that if you think about mathematics as a discipline, you can have sort of two large-scale stances towards it, thinking about what it's supposed to do. On the one hand, you could think that it is like the natural sciences, in the sense that it has a subject matter or a domain of things that it tries to correctly describe. So that would be one way of thinking of it. And then the question is, what is that domain? Well, it might be something that is not the ordinary material world, but rather some other special domain of mathematical objects that mathematics tries to correctly describe. And the thought is that mathematics does not have a domain it tries to correctly describe, but rather it does something else. It is tied to maybe either reason, or it's tied to some sort of complex social practice that is not descriptive of some special part of reality. Okay, so these two large-scale views seem to be intuitively different, and it seems that a deciding question, which view here you accept, is the question whether or not you think there are mathematical objects, whether or not you think there are such things as numbers, functions, spaces, and so on and so forth, the sort of classic mathematical objects. And therefore, it looks like the dividing question between these two kinds of views is one that's an ontological question, the question, are there numbers, right? But so the problem is that this question, it seems, is answered already in mathematics itself. So mathematics has established that there are infinitely many prime numbers. Nobody doubts that, in some sense at least. I mean, it's like one of the longest lasting mathematical results. So, but the issue is that it looks like the ontological question, are there numbers, which is supposed to distinguish between two large-scale views about mathematics that the philosophers were trying to ask, so to speak, from the outside, trying to understand mathematics as a whole, that this question is itself answered within mathematics, and therefore the philosophical project of trying to ask this question from the outside seems to be confused on the at first sight. Okay, so the question then is, how should we think about this philosophical project, in this case, an ontological question, or thinking that the ontology of mathematical objects is related to the large-scale philosophical question about mathematics? And now that you have a couple of different options, right? One of them, which is, I take it, dubious, right? Which I would call the immodest attitude, where the thought is that, yeah, sure, of course, mathematics answers the question, are there numbers? And the question is answered by Euclid's theorem, the infinite prime numbers, and many, many or most other things. But still, we philosophers can still wonder whether or not they gave the correct answer about this, and whether or not what is universally accepted in mathematics is in fact the correct answer. Okay, this is immodest in the sense that not that it couldn't be that the mathematicians got it wrong, but rather because you think that there's a project, a legitimate project that you're engaged in that just takes that stance towards them and thinks that you have something to contribute here that is just somehow has been neglected or something like that. So the thought is that the metaphysical project should be modest in the sense that whatever it's trying to do, it should be a legitimate project, even if what the mature sciences like mathematics and physics and so on and so forth, even if they are correct about what they're saying. Okay, so the project can't rely on that they might just be wrong. Because otherwise, it's just basically trying to say that we have to just question or re-investigate what they thought they have already established. And that's, of course, legitimate too, but that's not what metaphysics can be if it's really what anybody thinks it should be. Okay, so suppose you want to be modest, then the question is there any question of fact in that standpoint where you are modest towards the mature, successful, authoritative parts of inquiry that is still left open and that's legitimately asked by something like metaphysics, somebody like a philosopher? So then the question is, what's that question? So any question that meets that constraint, I would say, is in the domain of metaphysics. And the question is just, what questions are these? Are there any questions left? And what are they? How should we state them? And then if there are, how should we answer them? That's, I think, the setup, how I like to think of it.
So let me try to summarize what you're saying there, Thomas. It seems to me that there's a bit of a dilemma here, and the risk is that either metaphysical questions can become trivial. It seems clear that numbers exist in some sense, at least, or it can become simply a question for the special sciences, i.e., mathematics itself. That already settles the existence of numbers, and it's unclear what the role of metaphysicians is here. How are we supposed to give original input? Because we do not want to go to the mathematics department and tell them that numbers don't exist after all.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
the question is, what questions, if that setup is legitimate, what questions are in the domain of metaphysics, right? So I mean, there's a number of different ways you could try to approach that, right? So one is to say, and this is rarely endorsed, but sometimes, is that metaphysics does not actually aim to settle questions of fact. That's why it's doing something totally different than the sciences, which aim to settle questions of fact, but rather it's doing something else. And you have some options here. I mean, you could say that it is working out your commitments to a certain way of doing inquiry, but you're not thereby participating in the inquiry, or other options along those lines, where the thought is something that you're not trying to settle questions of fact, but rather you're trying to develop tools that then the people who do settle questions of fact could possibly use to settle the questions of fact. So, for example, you're exploring alternative conceptual schemes or alternative languages or things like that might be useful, even though not necessarily now, but might in the long run be useful for doing the sort of fact searching part of inquiry. The metaphysics itself is not part of, right? So that would be one line. Another way of thinking about it would be something like you think that there are these distinct questions of fact that metaphysics is trying to answer, and these questions are distinct because they're expressed with distinctly metaphysical terms. So like for example, one way to think about that is that I mean, that's in a sense a caricature, but just to bring out the possibility, is that metaphysics is trying to settle the question what's ultimately the case, whereas the science is trying to settle what's the case.
What's foundational, perhaps.
Yeah, right. So I mean, this could be, of course, as I said, it's a caricature at first, but so the thought is that what is ultimately what it's a distinctly metaphysical sense of in which something could be the case. It could be just ultimately the case, or anyway. So that would be one way in which you could say that there's a distinction between scientific inquiry or other parts of inquiry and metaphysics, because the question that metaphysics is trying to answer is expressed with distinctly metaphysical terms, and these terms play no role in other parts of inquiry, and that's what metaphysics is supposed to do. Okay, so this seems right. So one way of characterizing this would be as esoteric metaphysics, in the sense that the questions that are in the domain of metaphysics are expressed with distinctly metaphysical terms that are distinctly metaphysical in the sense that they're not employed elsewhere, they're not universally accessible, but rather they are something that you as a metaphysician must somehow grasp, but not everybody has access to. Okay.
So what sort of terms could these be? Do you have in mind the sort of terms that Kit Fine and Jonathan Schaffer perhaps use?
Well, I mean, I don't want to accuse individual people of doing this, but of course, so for example, Kit Fine's notion of reality is a good candidate for this. I guess I did accuse him of being esoteric, so I can just as well do it again. But right, so Fine's notion of reality that he uses, that where the thought is that it's crucial, a part of metaphysics is to try to find out what what's real or what reality is like, where reality is not supposed to be taken simply as a notion of reality that you would sort of ordinarily employ, where you might wonder, say, is the Loch Ness Monster real? Where that just doesn't really make a big difference between that and asking, does it exist?
Yeah.
But rather, reality is some, on one way of understanding this would be some special and distinct notion from the more ordinary notion of reality that's more metaphysical, and that also can't be spelled out in any other way. So if you could spell it out, of course, there would be nothing objectionable to it. But what's objectionable, it seems to me, is to think that the domain of metaphysics is to be spelled out in terms of distinctly metaphysical notions that you cannot explain in other terms, and that also are not accessible in general, that you just somehow, if you're metaphysically inclined, you grasp what they are. And otherwise, maybe you don't. And so, but the thought being then, wait a minute, then leaves metaphysics to be just a discipline for those who somehow grasp these distinctly metaphysical notions. And it becomes unclear why we would care finding out about what reality with a capital R is like, given that, you can't. So, okay, so the alternative, I take it, will be egalitarian metaphysics, where there is a domain of metaphysics. The questions in the domain can be spelled out in perfectly accessible terms. That are accessible to everybody. So whether or not that can be, whether or not there are such questions, that's so far left open by this, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we can agree that there are these two different ways of looking at the questions.
Right.
That there are two different questions that are relevant. And one of them is this ontological question, or I suppose you could call it quantificational question as well, whether there are a certain kind of things, whether there are any Fs in reality, whether there are numbers, or whether the Loch Ness Monster exists or something like this.
Right.
But the way I like to think about what you have characterized as esoteric metaphysics, which might focus on these notions, whether something is real, for instance, is in terms of what the objects in question, the entities in questions are like. So what the numbers are like, what is the nature of the numbers, or to use another, perhaps an esoteric notion, what the essence of the kind of entities that we're dealing with is like. And one issue, I suppose, is the order of these things. You can probably say fairly that everyone agrees that you can talk about the existence of things and about what these things are like. But you might differ about whether you first have to talk about the existence of things and only then talk about what these things are like. or whether you could do it the other way around.
Uh-huh.
But the way I like to see this this project that the esoteric metaphysics, perhaps what you have called esoteric metaphysics, is switching around the order of these questions. Do you think that this is a possible move at all?
Well, I'm not sure that the order of these questions is really central for this present issue, right? So somebody might well think that, let's say, what numbers are is the primary. What their essence or nature is the primary question. It's the secondary question whether or not anything has that essence or fulfills that role. So I could see somebody going either way on this, as I understand it. So.
Right. Well, let me give you an example about how I think this could go. About how we could first figure out what certain things are like.
Right.
Now, I like to think this in terms of possibility.
Okay.
And we can look at one of the recent hot debates in physics, whether the Higgs boson exists, right? Now, it seems that we don't yet know whether there is such an entity as the Higgs boson. We know something about what that entity would be like if it were to exist, but we don't yet know whether it exists or whether something like it exists.
Okay.
But what I consider relevant here is determining some sort of a range of identity and existence conditions, and then leaving it for the empirical sciences to figure out whether there in fact in the actual reality exists this sort of thing, the Higgs boson. But the idea here would be that it's possible, perhaps you could call it metaphysical inquiry if you like, to determine the identity and existence conditions of these things, or a range of such conditions, without going into the question of whether there really are, and this is not really in a capitalized sense, but whether they really are in actual reality, these sort of things.
Right.
This might be a different case with the numbers, but
so
this might be one example.
Right. So to clarify, so then what's the domain of metaphysics on this conception would be something like you try to find out what the essences or natures of certain things are, regardless of whether or not there are these things. Right. So that could apply to, would that apply to particular kinds of things like numbers, or just the general categories of things like objects and properties or things like that, or both?
I think both ideally, but it might be more difficult in terms of particular things. I'm not, for instance, quite sure what I would like to say about the case of numbers. Yeah.
But so the thought is that one question that's in the domain of metaphysics would be the question, say, what is the nature or essence of a human being? Right. And then the worry is, well, wait a minute, why is that question not a question for biology? Because what a human being is that's at least one possible challenge here, right? So what a human being that's a biological question. Say, that belonging to a certain species or being rational, that these, let's say, might be competing accounts of the nature of a human being. Right. So another question is that is it tied to conceptual analysis? Is it the concept of a human being that we have that we're investigating here? So I mean, that's just sort of, if you have that general approach that you sketched, these would be, I guess, natural follow-up questions.
That's true.
Right.
Yes. Well, I would not be very sympathetic to the idea that this is all a question of conceptual analysis.
Right.
So I would hope that there's some methodology that gives you access to what you might call essentialist facts or metaphysical facts that are not merely conceptualist facts. Now, of course, it's an open question as to what sort of cognitive faculty you use to determine these facts, whether you use strictly a priori tools or perhaps a posteriori tools as well. But I would not be a conceptualist in this sense.
Okay. So the notion of an essence that's at work here is that to be spelled out, or is that a notion that is it to be spelled out, say, in modal terms as something like, you wouldn't be human unless you had this particular feature?
I guess that's a good question, and this is something we should talk about. The sort of whether some notions are primitive. Now, I think that essence should not be characterized in the usual way, which is the modal way. So we should not reduce essence to modality,
Right.
but rather I'm sympathetic to the project that Kit Fine has made quite popular, which is to reduce modality, metaphysical modality in particular, to essence. So I would do it the other way around. But this does seem to, as you rightly put it, make essence a primitive notion, and perhaps this is something we could talk about. I understand that you're not a fan of primitive notions. You think that they are esoteric, as you put them.
No, not
Before,
necessarily.
perhaps.
It's not that all primitive notions are esoteric. So I mean,
Sure,
so
yeah.
lots of notions, I take it, are primitive that are not esoteric. It's just that so if the notion of an essence is primitive and plays this sort of really central role in metaphysics that that you want to give it, the question will be, I mean, how is it supposed to be understood? Is this a notion that we all intuitively grasp somehow, or is it because I mean, you might think that it's natural to think of essence at first as a modal notion, meaning a notion that's intuitively spelled out as, you wouldn't be this unless you had this particular feature.
Right.
And so it's like it's like a counterfactual kind of consideration, and it seems to me that these kind of considerations are perfectly egalitarian. They have a clear role in ordinary reasoning. Everybody engages in it, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing objectionable at all in doing that. But so then, when the thought is, no, the notion of an essence is not that. It's something else, something that's more basic than that. It becomes an issue, although it depends on how it's going to go, whether or not this is something that we should be dubious about, or should be possibly objectionable, or it's something that is perfectly fine and legitimate. And right, so then more will need to be said to settle the question whether or not this should be seen as esoteric or as non-esoteric, egalitarian. Right.
But it's not merely a question of primitivism, then.
That's right. No, primitive. No, of course, yeah, primitive. I mean, all kinds of stuff is primitive. That's right. So the esoteric egalitarian distinction, as I like to think of it, is not a distinction between primitive and defined in terms of the primitive, but rather one between part of our universally shared conceptual repertoire and something that is distinctly, uniquely metaphysical that's not part of that. So, I mean, this sort of sometimes comes up where people say that, look, I fairly understand what somebody means by ultimate reality, and I can't spell it out, but, my metaphysics buddy that I'm talking to also has a perfectly clear sense of what ultimate reality is supposed to be, and we engage in debates about what ultimate reality is like, but we can't explain it to you, outsider, because you just don't have that metaphysical inclination,
Right,
or something like that.
So
So this is the
becomes
kind of
something
thing.
done in an ivory tower.
Sorry?
Sorry. So metaphysics becomes something that's done in an ivory tower. You're concerned about this, yes?
Well, I mean, not just the ivory tower, but among a group of people that feel like they have access to certain things that right, and so there's just a general worry that maybe there is some illusion of content here, or in particular, there's also worry about why would you care finding out what ultimate reality, in the sense that you can't spell out, is supposed to be like. So, I mean, again, this is sort of an extreme case of esoteric metaphysics, but it highlights a kind of a concern that comes up in certain ways on which people do metaphysics, where the thought is that there's a certain important notion that seems intuitively pretty compelling. You can spell it out, you can explain it. Essence is one of them. But then the thought is that, well, but we're not using it in that way. We're using it in some other way. And that way is primitive, and we can't really spell it out. We just want to say that it's not the one you're thinking of. Okay, so then there's a potential concern that this is problematic. I mean, to put it charitably.
Yeah. No, I agree, and this is a valid challenge, I think, for anyone who does want to do metaphysics in terms of these notions.
Right.
I guess some of the other notions that have been prominent now in recent metaphysics are these notions of ground, priority, dependence, structure, perhaps.
That's
fundamentality.
Right. So those are, those are the ones that are very widely used these days in trying to say what's distinctive about metaphysics. That, that metaphysics is about the grounding relation or fundamentality, what fundamental reality is like. Things like that, where these kind of general concerns are relevant, it seems to me, because you're sort of walking this line between, what's fundamental, that's not a distinctly metaphysical concern. I mean, people talk all the time about what's fundamental. And so one example that, to me, illustrates the problem is if you again take a philosophy of mathematics example. So, in mathematics, in arithmetic, in particular, the theory of natural numbers, there's this common way of thinking of prime numbers as being a very fundamental part of the numbers, so that that knowing something about prime numbers is very revealing about the numbers. And the prime numbers are more fundamental to arithmetic than, say, the even numbers, which are merely the multiples of 2. But the prime numbers, they are really special, more fundamental. That's a natural way of thinking of them. But, it would be a mistake to conclude from that ultimate fundamental numerical reality is just prime numbers. Right? It just means that all the numbers are in various ways special. The fundamental naturally leads people to think that there's sort of fundamental reality contains just the stuff that's fundamental, and that's sort of special or more real, and the most revealing description of the world is just in terms of what's fundamental, sort of secondary and derivative. But I think the distinction between what's fundamental and derivative does not justify that kind of picture. And as it seems to me, prime number example illustrates, and the same applies throughout, so that you can acknowledge that there are certain things that are more fundamental than others, and that just means that they're maybe more revealing or something like that. But that doesn't mean that reality, in some sense, just contains those, or that So anyway, so there's the question. Okay, so if you take the sort of a notion of what's fundamental that is commonly employed, not to give you some sort of metaphysical picture that you intuitively wanted to have, then maybe you're using a different notion of fundamental that's not like that, but you also can't really spell out what it is. Then that becomes possibly esoteric again and dubious. So it's always a thin line between going esoteric and giving the game away by just saying that we're just using the notion as it's commonly used in other parts of English. Right. So that's the and the same is true for many notions like ground, structure, metaphysical structure. These are all notions that fall into this general category where these kind of concerns are there.
So I guess the hope of people who use, for instance, the notion of ground is that there would be some sort of an egalitarian reading for it. I think Kit Fine has these sort of examples that it's really the sort of everyday notion of ground that is in effect in metaphysics as well, in some sense. For instance, there's this example of I think he's given it's being the case that the couple Jack and Jill is married consists in nothing more than it's being the case that Jack is married to Jill. Now, whether that gives you an egalitarian notion of ground or not is perhaps open to debate. But the hope would be
right. I mean, so also about this tightest sense of explanation, right? That the ground is tied to explanation.
That's right.
I mean, right. So explanation, I take it, is perfectly egalitarian. Everybody does that all the time. It's just not clear that even in this example that there is an explanation here, so that that Jack and Jill are married is explained by that they're a married couple is explained by that they're married to each other, right? I mean, that doesn't sound like an explanation to me. So maybe there's a special notion of metaphysical explanation at work. Then, of course, the worry resurfaces. But maybe it's
that's right.
Right. If it's ordinary explanation, is that really an explanation? Would that be a good explanation? I mean, just you wonder Why are they a married couple? I say, well, they're married to each other, right? That seems like, I mean, that, it's not, doesn't it, I don't get the, oh yeah, kind of.
Yeah, I agree that it leaves something to be wanted. Uh, I guess
Right.
that we might hope that in the future we are able to specify this better because a lot of people
Right.
are working on this.
Right.
But
And I
we
mean, I'm
shouldn't
not
base our
saying
approach
that,
on that.
right, exactly. So I'm not saying that this project is doomed or something like that, but although I personally don't have my money on it, but but I think there is, and I guess, it's things are getting better and better in the sense that people are more sensitive to concerns that other people have about this
Hmm.
general way of doing metaphysics. Um, but there's a certain way of doing this project, relying on ground and fundamentality that just really is totally unsatisfactory, I think, and should be avoided. And there's certain things that are just wrong with it if you do it a certain way. And then there's a question about, can it be done better? And as far as I can tell, that's largely an open question. But right, but
I guess my worry here would be that unless we go for something like this, then it will be difficult to do metaphysics as I understand it, or as I would like it to be done. Of course, one option could be that we can't do metaphysics like this, but that would
that's
be
right.
an unfavorable result, I think, for everyone.
Right,
So,
but I mean that's on the table. I mean maybe what we're
mhm,
doing isn't really, I mean it's one of the options that we have to consider as a serious option, that maybe
sure.
metaphysics doesn't actually have anything to do. So as I said again, I personally don't believe that's true. I think that there are questions that are perfectly egalitarian questions that are part of ambitious as well as modest metaphysics. But the reason for that is nothing to do with ground or fundamentality or
Hmm.
essences. It has something to do with complexities in natural language that lead to issues like semantic underspecification. That so, for example, about that quantificational expressions have more than one reading, and that
Hmm.
that only one of those readings is sort of trivially answered and the other one is not answered. And that with certain other considerations, you can actually see that, for example, in the case of arithmetic, the question, are the natural numbers, is in fact not answered in arithmetic on its reading in which it expresses an ontological question. But that's
Sure.
but the reason why that's so is kind of involved, and involves considerations about what we do when we talk about numbers and what we do when we use quantifiers over numbers, and it's largely empirical and having to do with issues about um, just ordinary communication about numbers, and issues about various expressions having different readings and expressions appearing in singular term positions that are not referential, and things like that.
Hmm.
But so in the end, it turns out that that question, is a further question that can be asked by philosophers, so to speak, from the outside, looking at mathematics as a whole, or in this case, just arithmetic, and wonder, are there numbers? Is it about a domain of numbers? Um, and it turns out, I think that the answer is no. But anyway, but that has nothing to do with it has something to do with defending a domain of metaphysics as there being this further question that we wanted to ask, that seemed
Hmm.
legitimate to us, and that seemed to be a dividing question between sort of large scale philosophical views about mathematics. But it's not tied to these metaphysical notions like essence, ground, fundamentality, reality, that I take it you are, I mean, I know you are more sympathetic to. Right.
Yeah, yeah, you're right.
Right.
But I suppose the challenge, I take your challenge to be a legitimate one, that we should be able to specify these notions, and if not, perhaps we should be more modest as you try to be. But of course, I'm concerned that this may be on a slippery slope towards deflationism again. But let me ask you this: how should we be able to pick out the egalitarian notions? So we should have some sort of criteria for what's egalitarian and what's esoteric to be able to know when we might be slipping to the sort of immodest or overly ambitious um, esoteric metaphysics.
Well, I mean, you mean like the
So
definition of the notion, or practical criteria for deciding if a particular case falls?
practical
Okay,
criteria,
right.
perhaps.
So I mean, so for example, so let's take the case of modal notions, like just what's necessary, possibly, or counterfactual considerations, right? I take it that these considerations, like what would be the case if something else were the case, you can see that they have a clear role in just ordinary reasoning.
I see.
You try to deal with, prepare yourself for different situations that might arise. So you wonder, well, what would be the case if I did it differently? If we would have done this other thing rather than this thing, what would have happened, and so on and so forth. And you reason like that. And so that's something that everybody engages in. It's not something that's, I mean, it's unclear what precisely is going on and what's justified and so on and so forth, but it's not esoteric, because the relevant notions are universally accessible. So what's a clear case, right? One other case that's clearly on the esoteric side is this case of, let's say, like reality with a capital R, where somebody says, no, sure, I know tables and chairs are real, but are they part of reality? And then you wonder, well, what's the difference? Well, it's like the metaphysical sense of reality. Right? And you say, well, I don't get that sense. Well, I guess you're not a metaphysician. So, my metaphysician friends, I'll get it. Right? So that's clearly esoteric, where the thought is that, well, if you just don't have that notion, it's not your field, right?
Yeah.
Esoteric in the sense that
Yeah.
only those who really get it can be part of the debate. The rest, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I just don't get it, and that's why I find it objectionable. I feel excluded, but it seems, it seems dubious. And you can think about what precisely is wrong, even with that extreme case. There's a couple of people who talk to each other about what reality, capital R, is like, and the rest of us just have to do something else. But and then, I mean, there's certain, things that are clearly, sufficient for some notion to be egalitarian, but it's not clear if there's a dubious case, it might be difficult to decide. In particular, for example, so the notion doesn't have to be, it just has to be explainable or accessible from a shared repertoire. So, if you can introduce it in a sufficiently good enough way, then that would make it egalitarian, even if people right now don't already have it. So that's why I think that, if you start out with what seems to be an esoteric notion, like, let's say reality or ultimate reality or reality as it is in itself, you might be getting at something. You just, you have to continue trying to spell out what it is in egalitarian terms.
Sure, otherwise there might be a loss in communication.
Sure, otherwise there might
right,
be a
or
loss,
you just might be
just
thinking that you have some idea what's going on, but it's really an illusion. So that's why I think using these notions is not perfectly illegitimate in metaphysics. It just has to be seen as an intermediate stage towards an ultimate egalitarian way of spelling out what's at issue. So the reality as it is in itself is, I think, a good example, because there seems to be intuitively a legitimate difference. So if you take, like, I don't know, like transcendental idealism or something like that, it seems like, well, there's something there. It's just, it's probably a coherent view, but it's not clear how you can spell it out in a coherent way as it's intended. So that's actually an example that, I think is, it's an open question if transcendental idealism can be spelled out as it is intended. I mean, there are certain ways that are perfectly coherent, but they don't seem to really capture what it was supposed to have captured. So anyway, so that's why, it's not that you shouldn't use these notions. It's just that you can't stop there. You got to go on, and the commitment has to be to spell them out in egalitarian terms.
Sure. Can I try to spell out essence for you and
okay, yeah, absolutely, yeah, good, okay, yes.
So I think I share maybe your concern with the notion of real. I'm not sure if I understand it properly either, but I do think that I have an understanding of essence which is fairly egalitarian. And this is, you could maybe try to spell it out in terms of modality to begin with, not by reducing essence to modality, but by gaining this sort of an egalitarian understanding of the notion. So if modality is, as it seems to be, widely used modal notions, possibility and necessity, we have an understanding of what they are. And if we then have some independent reasons, good reasons to accept that modality, metaphysical modality at least, is somehow grounded or based on or reduces to essence, then there seems to be a link via this understanding, egalitarian understanding of modality, to an egalitarian understanding of essence. Perhaps in terms of the sort of identity and existence conditions, as I mentioned before, for possible kinds of entities. I'm not sure if this catches your egalitarian sense, but this would be my attempt at trying to catch it out.
So the question then would be, how is this reduction supposed to be understood, right? So so if modality reduces to essence, right, the thought is that would show that since modality is egalitarian, that essence is egalitarian, right? So the question is that like a theoretical reduction in the sense that the metaphysicians do this reduction in that they think there's this notion of essence that they use, and then they reduce modality to essence. Now that wouldn't thereby, make essence egalitarian. You wouldn't. I mean, the other way around might be better, right? Because then, if you reduce essence to modality, and modality is egalitarian, which it is, then you might think, oh, and of course now I see what essence would be, because you just gave me the reduction to modality, and I can use that to grasp what's at issue. But if the reduction goes the other way around, it's not clear that that would be good enough. I mean, it might sort of give you some constraints of what essence is supposed to be, but and that might be already, that might be pretty good. I mean, it might well be that essence is like a theoretical term, and it's characterized by its role and things like that, and that's all a step in the right direction, I think. Right. So I mean, essence, right. So okay. So essence is a tricky case in the sense that that it's fairly intuitive notion. There's good examples of it. The problem just is that once the examples can be spelled out to an extent in terms of modality, right? And so then there's other considerations about it. You say, well, I mean, wait a minute, that can't be sufficient because the modal notions, apply more broadly, and you get more things than just the actual essences. But then there's a worry about, well, maybe there's some sort of restriction, that you restrict yourself to certain cases that are specific to this particular example you had. And so there is a concern that if essence is then taken to be not spelled out in terms of modality, but rather a primitive further notion that particular aspect might lead it into an esoteric territory. But I guess, it will all depend on how it's supposed to go, as I would see it.
Well, I think we've got some common ground there. I see your concern, and of course you're right at that we should have to specify the reduction of modality to essence. There's Fine has these famous arguments for this. I don't think we should go into that right now. But that still does leave open this sort of a question that you raise. But I think that we have at least some sort of building blocks for an epistemic access to essentialist facts, or to bring back this factivity of metaphysics. This would be the sort of methodological story that I would like to follow. But of course, more work remains to be done.
Well, I mean, could we let's talk maybe of one example of somebody like the Singleton Socrates example? That's like a famous example of Kit finds to illustrate the difference between there being necessary connections and there being essences. So the example for those who made it this far into the program and don't know the example is that that Socrates and the set that consists only of Socrates, they exist necessarily together, right? So by assumption, sets, whenever there's a Socrates, there's also a set containing Socrates. But it's part of the essence of the Singleton, the set containing only Socrates, that it contains Socrates, but it's not part of the essence of Socrates that it's contained in the Singleton Socrates.
That's right. That's supposed to be very intuitive.
So, and it is totally intuitive, but I think the explanation for this intuitive felt asymmetry between the two cases is not one about essences, but rather it's about conceptual connections. Like there's a conceptual asymmetry, it seems to me. The asymmetry is the following, that it's a conceptual truth that if the Singleton Socrates exists, then Socrates exists. Okay, so that if the set containing only Socrates exists, then Socrates exists. That conditional, is a conceptual truth. Versus the other way around, the conditional is not a conceptual truth. So it's not a conceptual truth that if Socrates exists, then there is a set containing only Socrates, because it's conceptually possible that there are no sets at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like there's these sort of these essence examples, or examples of this sort of asymmetric dependence of things on each other, often exploit certain other asymmetries, like in this case a conceptual asymmetry, and a asymmetry between a conceptual implication about what exists, that give us this feeling that there is some sort of dependence relation there, but that this should not be seen as reflecting an insight into the natures of things or something more substantial, but rather that in this particular case, I think the explanation for the felt asymmetry between those two cases is tied to this conceptual. Right. Yeah. So okay, but of course that's just one way of thinking about the example, but right. So but that would be the kind of example that either could or could not motivate that we have perfectly good grasp of the notion of an essence that is not tied to modal notions. Like as I take it, Kit Fine thinks.
Yes.
Again, I'm sure he thinks that. So.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. Well, I mean, I suppose I would be a little bit worried about spelling this out in terms of a conceptual reduction, because it's not supposed to be a conceptual reduction. But
it's not a reduction. It's just an explanation for the felt asymmetry, yes. Right? So there's a asymmetry between those two cases that goes one direction. And since they both exist exactly under the same circumstances, which is totally symmetric, the question is what explains the asymmetry that we think that that the singleton depends on Socrates in a way that Socrates doesn't depend on the singleton. And I think that you can explain by the asymmetry between these conditionals being a conceptual truth one way, but not the other way.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So,
but I suppose that we do have good examples of asymmetric dependence relations. Do you just think that this is not one of such?
Right, of course, there's lots of, right. I mean, yeah, of course, there's lots of asymmetric dependence relations. It's just, the question is, are they revealing of some sort of, like if I just take standing on or something like that, then that's not relevant for the metaphysical project.
Sure, yeah.
Right,
but I had in mind these sort of examples coming from the fundamentality literature, like Schaeffer argues that the whole is prior to its parts and all that.
Right. Right. So there, the general idea. Right. So this should we talk about that issue about for example, yeah. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about whether you think that there is a legitimate metaphysical use for asymmetric dependence like this.
Like what?
Not involving just conceptual truths or conceptual reductions, but rather perhaps this structure of reality as the esoteric metaphysicians would like to have it.
Right. Okay. So that I take it is an open question in the sense that it's not clear that we do have notions that are powerful enough to really give us a substantial metaphysical project. Right. There's all kinds of asymmetric relationships, like supervenience.
Sure.
With certain kinds of supervenience that's asymmetric by definition and things like that, or various other things, but those are of limited use in the metaphysical project. And the question is, how can we do better? And I take it some of these people that we've mentioned, like Kit Fine and Jonathan Schaffer and others, think there are more notions that can be used, and that the question is, under what constraints is it legitimate to bring in such a notion? And I think that the cases that have been proposed don't meet the legitimate constraints. So then it's a further question whether or not one can do better, or of course also whether or not their constraints are reasonable and maybe should be ignored, which I don't think is the case. But I think they're reasonable and they shouldn't be ignored. Well, right. So that's I take it the issue. How this is going to play out in the long run, of course, is an open question. And but as I see it, the simplest way of trying to get a domain of metaphysics by just using some primitive, unexplained, and not explainable notion is illegitimate.
Okay, yeah. I think we can agree on that. Of course, I would
Okay.
hope to be able to spell all of these notions in the sort of way that you proposed it in an egalitarian sense, that is.
Right.
So
Right. Do you want to talk about? We haven't really mentioned Neo-Aristotelianism. You want to talk about that a little bit?
well, I'm happy to advertise it. I suppose some of these people that we mentioned identify themselves as Neo-Aristotelians.
Right.
And I understand that you've got this book coming out yourself, where you criticize these approaches somewhat and propose a more modest approach to metaphysics. So should we
Well, it's not
maybe
quite
conclude
coming
by-
out yet. It's in the. It's. But anyways, yes. Right. Right. You have a book that came out already.
Yes, I do. I've got it right here. Maybe I can show it to the camera.
All right. I can't see it because I'm just looking at my own computer screen. But
It's
I
called
know what it looks
Contemporary
like.
Aristotelian Metaphysics.
Right.
So this is a collection of essays that I've edited, and it brings together a number of these metaphysicians who perhaps identify themselves as Neo-Aristotelian, like Kit Fine and E.J. Lowe, for instance. And I guess that the contributors and myself share this idea that there is a room for the sort of approach to metaphysics, which takes it to be factive, takes it to concern a domain that is legitimately accessible to us, but is also perhaps parallel to science. So not necessarily challenging science, but giving it a grounding or acting in a foundational role for science as well. But would you like to say something about your own approach? Perhaps we can conclude.
Right. So I mean, so as I see it, I mean, to be not, I mean, I take it whether or not. Okay, so I'm not in the Neo-Aristotelian camp. I think that not that. I mean, yeah, right. So because the reason it's not that I think it's hopeless in principle or something like that, but so where the Aristotelian camp is basically understood as somebody who relies heavily on notions like essence, priority, substance, notions like that that Aristotle was using. Because it seems to me that the relevant questions in ontology and some other metaphysical questions as well are properly stated without these notions, and I think that these questions they're real, legitimate, factual questions, in particular, say, ontological questions, but they're not stated in terms of these notions, but they are in the domain of metaphysics, understood in this particular way that I was outlining earlier. So, in addition, I guess I don't think there is as much unity in metaphysics as Neo-Aristotelians generally think. That they think that metaphysics has as its subject matter either the natures of things or the grounding or fundamentality or fundamental reality or things like that, or what the substances are. It seems to me that there is no unified subject matter in metaphysics like that, and that these considerations, however I can make sense of them, do not play the central role in metaphysics. I rather think that questions about what exists and what there is are more substantial than Neo-Aristotelians generally think, who take those questions often to be trivial, and I think they're often non-trivial. I think that they're usually not settled in a simple way that people, Neo-Aristotelians and maybe others as well, think they are settled, partly because I think that the complexities in natural language that give rise to talk about, our notion of existence and quantification involved is more complicated than other people think that these questions are trivial, and that's why I think there's much more work to be done in figuring out what we should think exists and whether or not certain sentences depend on the existence of certain things. So, for example, I think that arithmetic does not imply the existence of numbers. Even it doesn't imply that the relevant reading of that sentence that expresses an ontological concern, but rather that quantification is polysemous. It can be used in more than one way, and on one of its ways, arithmetic implies that directly, but that's not the way in which it answers the ontological question, which is also stated with the words, are there numbers or do numbers exist? Because these sentences have different readings and they express, and they're not, one is a metaphysical reading, the other one is a non-metaphysical reading, but rather these correspond to different functions that quantifiers have in natural language, different roles that existence has, and talk about existence in just ordinary communication, that then give rise to these problems that seem to be problems for stating ontological questions and how we should answer them and things like that. So in the sense that, as I said at the beginning, I think that I'm sort of in the middle, in the sense that I think there are legitimate metaphysical questions, and there, and metaphysics can be ambitious in the sense that it has certain further questions left open that it needs to answer that are not answered in these other parts of inquiry in sort of an immediate way that would make it problematic. But I'm also not in the on the neo-Aristotelian side of things, where I think that there's a distinct subject matter for metaphysics, or that I think that these questions are expressed with specifically metaphysical notions like ground, fundamentality, substance, essence, and so on and so forth. So that's basically where where I would place myself.
Okay, yeah. I guess that the one thing that we both have to address is right. What is the relationship between metaphysics and science? Because one challenge here, as right. we've identified, seems to be that maybe science already answers these questions. I think the neo-Aristotelian camp has a good answer to this question, and this right. is that metaphysics has this foundational or even enabling role for right. science. But how do you see?
So I find that problematic, right? So I find this particular, what E.J. Lowe, his approach to the possibility of metaphysics, I find it problematic in the sense that one way of stating it, which might be uncharitable, is that this idea that that science assumes that change is possible, and under that assumption, it continues. Let's say, to take the problem of change is one example, right? So science assumes that change is possible, and under that assumption, it proceeds and tries to account for various changes. And the role of metaphysics is now to cash in that assumption, to show that change really is possible. Right?
Sure.
And it seems to me that's not how it works. It rather that science accounts for various changes and thereby shows that change is possible. And similarly, for other examples, like it's not the case that arithmetic or mathematicians assume at the outset that there are numbers, and then on that assumption, to be cashed in later, they proceed in doing arithmetic, but rather that they do arithmetic and that the results they establish there imply that there are numbers. And on the basis of that, we have good reason to think that there are numbers in the relevant sense in which it is implied by arithmetic. So this sort of foundational role understood this way, that science makes certain assumptions about the possibility of certain things, and then metaphysics cashes them in the sense of showing that these things are really possible. I do not want to subscribe to that project. Although it would satisfy some of the criteria that were set out, but I just don't think that's what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, let me just specify. So the idea is, of course, not that we should go and tell the scientists that change is not possible and therefore they can't look into that, or tell the mathematicians that numbers are not possible. But yes, I mean, I can see your concern otherwise. But what is your own approach to the relationship between metaphysics and science? Because I see this as a problem for the middle ground as well. Right. Whether you have a legitimate claim for the independence of metaphysics from science. Right.
So I don't think that metaphysics, for metaphysics to have a domain, that domain has to be completely independent from science, or absolutely independent. Right. It just has to be sufficiently independent to justify this as a separate further question. So the official line I take on this is that the answer to the question in the domain of metaphysics can be immediately implied by the relevant the relevant authoritative parts of science, which would be the case if you think that metaphysics asks questions like, are there numbers? And mathematics has shown that there are infinitely many prime numbers.
Right.
Right. So that can't be it. Right. But it doesn't have to be that for metaphysics to be legitimate, it has to be completely separate, right? That constraint also would be too strong for any other scientific discipline. It's not that. For sociology to be legitimate, there could be no implicational relations between sociology and biology or something like that, right? That would be too strong. It can't be that, the answers are already totally settled and immediately implied by something else that's authoritative. And you can't think that, well, there's a further project in trying to find these answers.
Okay.
So it is actually 1:05 I have here on my thing. So we should probably
I suppose we could wrap it up. I think we've covered a lot of the important topics here.
Right. So what's our upshot?
Well,
there's more work to be done.
There's certainly more work to be done. I think we agree that there is this sort of an epistemic challenge for the sort of approach that I would identify myself with, the sort of neo-Aristotelian project.
Right.
But I still think that it's difficult to hold the middle ground as you try to do. It's a very commendable position. If you can pull it off, I congratulate you.
Right. I mean, so it's I mean, there's sort of this tempting line to think that that if you think that there's just one reality, the sciences try to find out what's going on there. So metaphysics can't have there can't be any space left for it, right? And that I think a number of people take that line, and we both don't want to take that line. So we don't think, both of us, that the task of metaphysics is simply to do something about the sciences, like to show that how they relate to each other, or to educate certain conflicts among scientific theories or something like that, but rather that they have, there's a legitimate project here. It's just the question is, why is it legitimate in light of this? And what precisely is in its domain, and how is it to be addressed once we figure that out, what's in its domain? And these are all ongoing debates.
Okay. I think that's a good note to wrap it up. We can agree with that. Well, thanks for having the chat, and thanks.
Yeah, sure. Nice talking to you. All right.
Okay.
I'll see you later. Bye.